Jonah Reed burst into the corridor, thrusting a palm-sized codex at Elias while ink crawled across the margin. Fear tightened Elias's throat and pushed him to his feet without thought. Elias, look, it's moving, Jonah voice raw. He held the book so the lantern light sheared down the guttering vellum. The immediate problem was simple and brutal. The restricted book had been handled outside protocol, and something in its marginal ink reacted when touched. Elias reached and took the folio with careful fingers. He felt his palm go cold where the leather had grazed him. He folded his thumb over the edge and pulled the strip of ribbon free. He had a ledger on his desk and a set of handwritten accession numbers. Institutional order mattered to him more than most things. In the next breath, he pushed order aside because Jonah's hand trembled and because the margin's black scratches were forming a sigil under the light. Elias had been an archivist and occult researcher for 2 decades. He knew the rules of containment and the reasons libraries locked certain things away. He also knew that rules existed because people had been hurt. He moved Jonah down the corridor and kept his voice clipped. Tell me exactly where you found it, Jonah. Shelf 3, locked case behind the John D. collection, Jonah. He kept saying the shelf name as if repeating a ward. How did you get it out? Elias. Jonah's eyes darted toward the reading room door. I took it after hours. I borrowed a key from an old student who owes me a favor. I only meant to see the marginalia. Jonah's hands went to his jacket as if searching for a talisman. Elias stepped closer and smelled old wax and Jonah's sweat. The immediate stakes were clear. A breach of archive protocol and a possible physical contamination tied to the codex. That possibility forced a decision. Elias's first emotion was suspicion. He tightened his jaw and watched Jonah's fingers. He thought the student favor explanation thin. Elias, why behind D? Who catalogued it last? Jonah swallowed. No record. There was a wax seal with a faded sigil. I thought it was just an ex libris until the ink started to move. Elias's suspicion altered into focused concern when he saw the margin sink pulse once, like a slow heartbeat. They walked to the restricted reading room doorway. Agatha Pembroke stood there, hand on the brass latch. She wore the library's dark coat, the top of her grey bun catching a sliver of lantern light. Elias set the codex on the threshold and met her gaze. Agatha, I need formal access. This book moves. He avoided theatrical phrasing and kept to facts. Agatha's reply was a flat refusal. You know the protocol, Dr. Marlowe. Containment is the curator's decision. You will not bring artifacts from the vault into the reading room unsupervised. Her voice cut across the corridor. Jonah stepped back. Alias, Agatha, look at the marginalia. Jonah says the ink shifts when touched. Agatha's mouth tightened. We classify them as hazards for a reason. Dispense with theatrics, Elias. The institution will not risk exposure. Her stance pushed against Elias' need to inspect. Elias felt an internal shift. The suspicion that Jonah had been careless moved into irritation. He moved his hands to the codex edges and found the wax tab Jonah had peeled. You broke the seal. Agatha. Elias replied, we will either document it here or hand it to Master Hale for containment. Either way, I need to see the inner folios. Agatha's posture did not budge. Jonah began to pace, rubbing his palms against his thighs. Elias made a choice. He would not escalate in public. He, Jonah, to bring the codex to a borrowed table in the dim alcove within the stacks. Agatha's refusal echoed, but Elias moved with the deliberate calm that appeared in his lectures and at his table. He wore his tailored coat and the worn leather satchel at his hip. He carried the brass magnifier tucked into his palm and slid the antique spectacles onto the bridge of his nose. They worked quickly. The alcove offered a single reading lamp and 2 chairs. Jonah set the codex down and Elias untied the small strip of ribbon binding the inner folios. He felt impatience rise into urgency. The inner folio unfolded with a faint rasp. The first sheet held protective ink. A ring of chalked words overwritten with hurried prayers scraped into the margins. There was a folded slip glued to the verso. These prayers have been partially erased, Elias murmured. He angled the lamp and used his magnifier to trace the erased letters. Jonah leaned in, breath close. Someone tried to unwrite them. Jonah, there's something about a pact in the slip. Elias read aloud. He smoothed the paper and found a short, precise notation. A name, a date, and a reference to a local disappearance 3 years prior. At that moment the corridor door opened and Master Hale entered. He carried a ledger and wore the curator's thick gloves. Elias had worked with Master Hale before and knew the man liked procedure. Master Hale's face was closed. His voice, when he spoke, left no room for argument. Hand it over, Just Marlowe. You have no authority to inspect restricted items without my authorization. His gloved hand hovered near the codex. Elias felt a second emotional shift. The irritation and focused concern now slid toward frustration. He straightened and said, Master Hale, read this slip. There is a reference to Reeve Lane's disappearance. Master Hale's eyes narrowed. We contain for the public good. You risk contamination and rumor. Give it to me. Jonah stepped forward, voice hoarse. Master Hale, if it links to a disappearance, don't you want me to tell the family? His plea exposed the fault line between institutional control and immediate human need. Master Hale produced a briefer of containment forms and recited regulations. We follow archive law. We will quarantine. That's final. Elias forced a quieter negotiation. He offered a compromise. The codex would be documented in Elias's ledger, photographed under cross, polarization, and then turned over. Master Hale's jaw worked. Jonah's hands shook as he watched the men argue. Elias and Jonah opened the inner folio further. They found scratched prayers. Elias read the scraped words aloud. Short verbs, names, a directive. The folded slip mentioned a pact bound to the object and an instruction to seal the mark upon the taker. Jonah's face went pale. When he reached to refold the slip, the blood-like stain along the folds smudged, and a dark shape blossomed on the page. Jonah recoiled. It's hot, he muttered, and his fingers left a faint print on the vellum. Elias reached to steady him. Jonah unfolded a second sheet, and a small smear of dark residue pressed against his fingertip. The residue seemed to thicken and form a raised impression. Elias felt the hairs on his forearm lift. He Jonah to keep his hand steady and to breathe slowly. The residue leaned into the skin. A pattern emerged on Jonah's palm. A small sigil that matched the marginal mark. Jonah yelped and pulled his hand back. It burned. Jonah. His voice rose, then broke. Elias took Jonah's fingers into his own hand and inspected the mark, a faint, moth-shaped impression, dark at the center. Jonah's breathing quickened. Elias's fear returned in a sharper bodily form. He noticed the pulse in his temple. He moved to the table and set the codex between 2 sheets of acid, free board. He performed a procedure from memory, dusting the ink with powdered chalk and applying a thin strip of linen to see whether the stain transferred. Master Hale protested and reached to seize the codex. Brother Alden slipped from the stairwell nook into the light and placed himself between Master Hale and the book. Brother Alden spoke with urgent, low tones. You handle it wrong. I can perform the proper rites to render the ink inert. He wore a scholar's habit under a coat and a chain with an obscure seal. Elias had not expected outside ritual intervention. He felt suspicion spike again. Brother Alden, we are not performing rites in the stacks. Elias, we will record, then contain. Brother Alden's eyes met Elias's, and he shook his head. There is a cipher in the margin that indicates sequence. These codices are not solitary. They function together. If you only seal this one, you risk triggering another linked item. Brother Alden's words introduced a new variable. Elias' practical mind noted a different danger. Institutional containment could be naive if the books were intentionally connected. Jonah's feathered forehead glistened. Master Hale tightened his gloves and said, No ritual here, Alden. This is an archive, not a chapel. The 3 men argued across the table in rapid exchanges. Elias leaned down to the codex again. He used his magnifier and turned the page. The marginal cipher was not purely symbolic. It contained a sequence of numbers and place names, and an instruction scratched in a hurried hand. Bind the mark. Do not speak the name. Elias read that aloud. Bind the mark. Jonah whispered, "Is that what happened to Reeve Lane?" Jonah's fingers found his palm and rubbed the fresh muth print. Brother Alden stepped in with urgency. "We must perform a neutralization. The ink resists straightforward archival methods. It binds to flesh. I have rights to sever its claim once the writing is engaged." Master Hale glanced at Agatha at the doorway. She stood motionless with a ledger clutched to her chest. "If you begin rites and they fail, you endanger everyone in this wing, Agatha." Tension rose toward its peak. Elias felt the final emotional shift. Concern and suspicion collapsed into decisive action. He would not allow a failed rite to spread harm, nor would he accept containment that smeared blame onto nameless victims. We do a controlled neutralization at the table. Jonah stays away from the codex unless supervised. Brother Alden, you will explain each step before you touch the book. Master Hale, you will record every action. The men snapped into procedure. Brother Alden arranged 3 candles and set a small packet of deacon powder near the codex. He spoke in short sentences and produced a thin iron pin. He first read aloud a short formula and then touched the iron pin to the margin. The ink hissed where the pin stroked the letters and a thin plume of glyph smoke rose. Jonah bent toward the smoke and coughed. Master Hale lunged to seize the codex as the characters in the margin began to rearrange themselves with a wet sound. There was a sudden rush of movement. Brother Alden reached for the codex to shield it. Master Hale grabbed the cover and pulled. Jonah fell back from the table and landed against a stack. The codex resisted. It seemed heavier than its size should allow. Elias flung his weight to stop Master Hale. "Let go." Elias in a sharp voice, "Let go, Master Hale." The 2 men strained in a brief, physical tug. Jonah groaned and clutched his chest. Elias had to choose in the instant. He decoded the slip's directive and recognized the pattern. If the codex was forcibly torn in an uncontrolled manner while glyph smoke issued, it might bind more strongly to the nearest flesh. He twisted his body, forced the codex toward Brother Alden's hands, and knocked the iron pin free. The pin skittered across the table. Jonas landed on his knees and vomited into a waste basket. Master Hale called for staff. Agatha moved to the doorway, reading the situation as institution vs. hazard. The physical clash broke and institutional control regained footing. Men moved to wrestle the codex into containment. Agatha called for archival chests and Master Hale read the emergency code aloud. Jonah was fevered and whispered a single line. "It pressed into my skin." Elias placed a gloved hand on Jonah's shoulder and felt the rapid trembling beneath. He listened to the staff's controlled, officious commands and felt both relief and unease. They sealed the codex in a hardened archival chest. The staff used chains and lead-laced seals. Elias watched each motion with clinical attention. He recorded the accession numbers and photographed the marginalia using the cross. Polarization rig Master Hale authorized. Brother Alden watched the ceiling with clenched fingers. Jonah sat on a stool, palms open, and touched the muth-shaped impression with a trembling forefinger. That night in the archival vault antechamber, Agatha insisted on institutional quarantine. She pronounced steps aloud. Chest to antechamber to cold vault, no external contact. Master Hale nodded and read the entries into the ledger with his firm voice. Jonas's temperature rose and he muttered names in a sleep, thin voice. Elias negotiated a guarded compromise. He would keep the marginal sketch in his personal ledger for study, but he would not remove the codex from institutional custody. The final beat of the evening occurred back at Elias's desk. He catalogued the night's events in his hand ledger, while the library emptied and lights blinked off. He traced the marginal cipher onto a small note and slipped it into his pocket. He felt fatigue in his shoulders and a pressure behind his eyes. He washed his hands with warm water and felt the muth-shaped impression still faint on his palm. He noted the mark in his ledger with methodical handwriting. Elias sat alone at his desk and opened his pocket journal. He placed the small marginal sketch beside his lamp. He wrote a short, clinical note, Codex, unknown origin linked to 2019 disappearance. Containment enforced, partial neutralization attempt failed. Person exposed. Jonah Reed. He closed the ledger and slid the sketch into his coat pocket. He felt relief that formal containment had occurred, unease that something in the Codex had left a mark on a living person. He heard a sharp knock at his study door. He rose and opened it a crack. Master Hale stood there with a small sealed envelope. For you, Juta Marlowe. An internal memo and a restricted summons for tomorrow morning at 9:30. The council wishes to review the Codex. Elias took the envelope. He felt the moth impression on his palm throb once. Thank you, Master Hale. He closed his door. Elias removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He checked Jonah's health on the way out. The student had been taken to a clinic within the college and was being monitored. Elias noted the names he could now recall. Jonah Reed, Agatha Pembroke, Master Hale, Brother Alden. He associated each name with a role. Jonah, the reckless finder. Agatha, the institutional sentinel. Master Hale, the procedural curator. Brother Alden, an uneasy ally. He rose from his desk and placed one last item into his pocket. The small marginal sketch he had traced earlier, folded and fragile. He had taken it partly out of habit and partly because habit kept him close to danger. He felt the moth impression on his palm as cold and real, and he felt a decision form in the back of his mind. He would follow the chain of codices if the institutional path failed to address it. As he left the stacks, Elias paused beneath the library arches and turned once to look at the sealed chest in the antechamber, visible through a barred window. He watched the staff move like clockwork around it. He tasted the metal of his resolve and the bitter wax of worry. A knuckle rapped on his study door. Elias tightened his coat, folded the sketch into his ledger, and closed his notebook. He slid the marginal sketch into his pocket and felt the moth-shaped impression on his palm, just as a hand knocked again. He answered the knock and stepped into a corridor lit only by low lamps and the sound of pages settling in locked rooms. The immediate conflict, the Codex in Jonah's hands, the aborted neutralization and the institutional quarantine had been resolved in practical terms. The mark on Jonah's palm remained a living consequence. Elias had kept a copy of the marginal sketch and had a summons awaiting him. He had recorded events with careful language. He also had a new, private question burning at the back of his mind. Which other codices formed the sequence, and who had bound them to human flesh? He walked toward Master Hale's summons with a ledger under his arm and a moth impression pressed into his palm, each step deciding whether to follow the library's rules or the dangerous trail the Codex had just revealed. Jonah slammed the lab door open, cradling the palm-sized Codex while black ink crawled across the margin like a living stain. Suspicion tightened Elias Marlowe's throat and pushed him into motion. He moved without ceremony, stepping over a stool and taking the book from Jonah, shaking hands. Elias, look. Jonah, voice raw and clipped. He did not wait for the sentence to finish before thrusting the open page under the conservation lamp. The ink had formed a sigil and was spreading outward from a scraped place at the gutter. Within those first breaths the problem was clear. The manuscript was altering itself and touching it left a stain. Elias's suspicion shifted into methodical urgency. He set down his satchel, rubbed his temple, and snapped open the brass magnifier by habit. He had the feel of an academic who had read too many warnings. He had the posture of a man who measured danger by technical terms. In the space of a single minute he arranged nitrile gloves, lifted a small evidence tray, and barked an order, Mira, Anna, masks on. Jonah stepped back. The names were spoken like tools that moved the room. They had met earlier that evening in the reading room. They had watched the Codex margin creep, while Jonah had shouted in the corridor. Elias referenced that burst into the corridor and Jonah's earlier shout as though scoring events on a ledger. He did not say, Remember when you ran it here. He listed facts, the codex, margin activity, Jonas' hands stained, that inventory guided every choice. His professional life was a ledger of small certainties, and suspicion now governed his decisions. Mira Hargrove set a containment cradle on the bench with quick, precise hands. We seal first, Mira, tone flat. She laid a strip of polyester film and began to fold it into a low tent. Her movements were conservation training. Steady, efficient, unwilling to gamble. Mira, if we close it now we lose the imaging record, Elias replied, fingers already finding the portable imaging rig. Elias, you can argue risk away. This is protocol. The argument was immediate and edged with accusation. The disagreement hardened the room into two teams. Jonah hovered near the doorway, paper towel still wrapped around his fingertip where the stain had run. Anna Voss, the graduate conservator, stood by the OV station with a laptop open and fingers poised over the keyboard. Each person moved to a station. The division in the room became visible in the placement of bodies and tools. Elias's suspicion turned into curiosity. His curiosity pushed him toward the imaging console, toward data that might explain the material mechanism. Anna began the multispectral pass. She clipped the codex into a padded cradle and programmed wavelengths, 40 at first. Anna. Her voice was flat with concentration. The scanner hummed. Light washed across vellum and pigment in narrow bands, revealing scraping marks and faint palimpsest beneath the top layer. Anna, there are erased hands here. Someone scraped lines and wrote again. Elias leaned in, magnifier poised, eyes scanning the spectral map on Anna's screen. As Anna toggled wavelengths, pale undertext resolved into letters and a name. Elias recognized a surname clipped in a hurried hand. The name arrested him, personal and precise. A dedication hidden beneath the scraped surface bore a name Elias had not heard aloud in years. His hand stiffened around the magnifier. He did not gasp. He dropped his head and pinched the bridge of his nose. For all his outward control, the discovery landed as a personal strike. The emotion shifted again. Curiosity moved into alarm. The manuscript had a connection to Elias' past that he had not expected. He spoke quietly but with directness, read it again. Anna. The letters after the dedication. Anna adjusted contrast and read the faded line aloud. To GM of St. Isles. No, the next glyph is different. To Jonathan Maudlin for service rendered. Elias froze. That Jonathan Maudlin was a name tied to a scholarship Elliot Elias had once applied for as a young researcher. Memories slotted into place. A rejected application form, a small envelope with a gold seal, a cancelled correspondence. He had not expected his past to be inked into a palimpsest that now moved on its own. Mira, watching the exchange, squared her shoulders. We seal and log. Now, her voice carried the weight of institutional responsibility. She declared procedures and leaned on rules that were meant to stop contagion, intellectual and physical. Elias felt the room narrow around that command. He felt his work as historian press against the vault of the archive. He wanted the image records. Mira wanted the vault. The conflict was no longer theoretical. Jonah put his stained palm under the lamp. The dark mark had spread into the creases of his skin. He kept his fingers splayed as though by holding them open he might slow the movement. It burned when I touched it. Elias, Jonah, voice high and thin. It wasn't heat. It felt like... He stopped, jaw rigid. It felt like pressure on the middle of my palm. Jonah's description turned a technical problem into a bodily hazard. The team's decision would no longer be about epistemology alone. Elias swallowed and set his jaw. He also knew the archive ledger. Decisions made now were recorded, and the record mattered to tenure committees and later researchers. He stepped close to Jonah, ignoring Mira's hand raised in protest. He let Jonah's finger press the stained edge toward his magnifier and leaned in. He examined the stain against magnified vellum grain and the faint sigil. He felt the signed weight of responsibility press against his shoulders. His curiosity and suspicion were colliding with duty. Anna, take a high-resolution pass on the margin. Then infrared. Now, Elias spoke each instruction like a prayer to a liturgy he had learned in graduate school. Anna obeyed. She moved through menus and settings with practiced fingers. The machine clicked and started the infrared sweep. The initial spectral images had shown palimpsest layers. The infrared revealed further scraping patterns and a faint, hurried dedication name beneath another scraping. The layers read like someone deliberately hiding authorship. Mira tightened the polyester tent and scanned the EDS tags on her tablet. We quarantine the object once we close it. No question, her posture said the vault would be the Codex's home that night. Elias swallowed another objection. He wanted to document more. He wanted to read aloud the marginalia, where letters had begun to move. He wanted to record Jonas' palm as evidence of contact. Instead, he proposed a compromise. We photograph every angle. We make an encrypted image set and store it offsite. Then we seal. Mira looked at him and then at Anna and Jonah. A decision hovered in the sterile air of the lab. The disagreement turned to a rapid exchange of lines. We seal now, Mira insisted. We image now, Elias countered. You will spread contamination, Mira. You will destroy evidence. Elias replied, I refuse to gamble the vault. Mira shot back. I refuse to let it disappear. Elias answered. The back and forth lasted 6 short lines and landed like a fist on a table. Jonah's fingers tightened on a paper towel. Anna's eyes flicked between the two. The argument was the external event the chapter needed. It forced the group toward a decision. Anna's infrared pass completed with an unexpected artifact. The screen filled with a series of thin strokes that had not been visible under multispectral light. The strokes arranged themselves into a dedication dated with a year Elias did not expect. The name repeated, and below it a terse statement. By pact sealed, the 3 words were concrete and chilling. The team had been debating procedure. The manuscript had provided a claim. Elias' breathing shortened. He leaned forward. Pact sealed, he said aloud. The words required a definition. He knew ritual language. He had taught classes about pacts and ritual formula. He also knew how easily a phrase could be misread. He for an annotated translation and Anna supplied one, speaking carefully. This phrase is formulaic. It appears in marginal rites of binding, often alongside names and witness marks. The room grew louder with concrete detail. Jonah slid to the bench and then to the floor in a small falter. His eyes rolled inward and his jaw loosened. A cold breath moved across the bench. The codex emitted a thin smoke that pooled under the fume hood and smelled faintly of beeswax and something metallic. Jonah's hands went slack. He spoke in a flat voice and then stopped mid-syllable. No, he slumped forward. Elias reached without thinking and steadied Jonah's shoulder. The professor's hands were steady. His pulse ticked behind his fingers. He felt Jonah's breath on his knuckles, shallow and reedy. Anna called out for a first aid kit and Mira hit the emergency power to the imaging rig. The strobe of alarms did not start. Instead, there was the whisper of filters and the metallic clink of tools. The room turned into a place of exact movements. Mira took Jonah's wrist and checked his pulse. Anna turned the codex so the binding faced away from Jonah and toward the fume hood vent. Elias felt the whole scene like an experiment that had invaded the living. For a moment, Elias lost strict control. He felt the impulse to touch the page. He felt the compulsion like a solid, physical tug in his knuckles. He fought it by anchoring to a concrete task. Photograph the margin with a handheld macro camera. He ordered Anna to hold Jonah steady while he fired off close images. Each shutter click was a deliberate refusal to yield to the compulsion. The codex answered. Ink ran faster along the margin and pooled at Jonah's fingertip where the dark stain had been. The pool thickened into a rounded sigil and then exhaled a cold, dark smoke that formed a faint impression over the bench. The impression looked like darkened vellum kutat hovering a finger's breadth above the pages. Jonah moaned and drew back, eyes glassy. Elias felt a second emotion shift. Alarm became terror in his body. He did not vocalize it. He chewed a corner of his lip and spoke in short clipped orders. Anna, shut the lights to level 3. Mira, retrieve the wax seals. Jonah, stay with me, look at me. Jonah, name one thing you see. Elias's lines were sharp, each one an action he forced into the room. Jonah blinked and stammered. A face, no letters. Cold, his voice trailed. The impression above the page pulsed as though tasting Jonah's words. Elias reached and placed a gloved finger against Jonah's wrist to keep him steady. He felt the rapid heartbeat and the way Jonah's skin had cooled under the stain. The impression sank lower and the smoke coiled into the outline of a handprint on the bench. Anna, something s completing, the word completed had mechanical finality. Mira dumped a packet archival wax into a small warming pan. She moved fast and direct, her face set. Elias watched her. He watched the seam between preservation and curiosity tighten until it was a line of heat. She carried the warmed wax, lifted the codex, and they forced the pages closed together. The ritual was not hers by training but by necessity. She applied the wax to the binding and pressed a seal. The team sealed the book and Mira stamped the seal with an institutional press. The wax set cool and dull. For a beat the lab was a collection of held breaths. Jonah lay on the bench, palms dusted with dark grains. Anna wept a single quick tear and wiped it with a gloved hand. Elias felt fingers numb with after-touch. He kept his magnifier in one hand and his signet ring flashed when he pressed his thumb against it. He had made a choice. He had pushed for images, and he had allowed the sealing. The team's conflict had resolved into a practical compromise. A record now existed and the codex lay closed. They moved the sealed codex to the vault antechamber on a wheeled cart. The corridor to the vault smelled of cleaning solvent and old stone. Mira logged the accession number and argued for immediate quarantine paperwork. Elias argued for a handwritten chain of custody notes stored separately. They compromised again, a paper ledger in a secure envelope and a digital encrypted copy of the images. Jonah walked beside them on unsteady legs, the stain wrapped in a paper towel. Anna stayed behind to run a final spectral check and to photograph the bench and impressions for the archive. At the station Anna paused and spoke in a small, tight voice. Elias, before we close this out, there's one more image. She rotated the infrared layer and amplified a faint line that had been overlooked. The line was a microscopic inscription along the inner gutter, a dedication directed at a living person. Elias recognized the handwriting. It matched a letter he had once burned in an office trash can decades before. The recognition hit him like a ledger page flipped sharply. He felt a personal threat materialize out of ink. He for the line to be transcribed and read aloud. Anna obliged and read, to Elias Marlowe for keeping silence when required. The 3 words fell like documentation of an accusation. Elias felt his mouth dry. He had not expected a dedication to him. The manuscript's hidden dedication changed the stakes from institutional to personal. The emotion shifted again. Alarm folded into an acute, pointed dread. He ordered the ledger sealed in a different envelope and slid his pocket journal into his coat, where the ribbon bookmark rested under his fingers. They reached the vault antechamber and handed the sealed package to the registrar on duty. Mira completed the quarantine paperwork with neat handwriting. Jonah stood near the wall, rubbing his stained fingers against the back of his glove. Anna stayed by the door and ran one more image on her tablet. Elias watched their movements and felt the weight of choices aligning into consequence. He had asked for records, and he had protected the codex. He had also discovered a dedication that linked him to the manuscript's past. In the quiet of the vault corridor, Elias folded his hands and kept them visible. He had to make a physical decision. Leave the contaminated ribbon behind or take it. He had argued for evidence, and now his hands reached to the inside pocket where the paper ribbon had been. His action was not theatrical. He slipped the stained ribbon into his coat pocket under the signet ring and felt its damp edge press against fabric. He did this while Mira's back was turned and Jonah and Anna were discussing chain of custody details. Elias' final act in the room resolved the chapter's moral fracture in a concrete way. He had compromised with institutional rules and had also retained a private piece of evidence that might explain the manuscript's motive. He left the vault corridor with the codex contained, the ledger sealed in duplicate, and the stained ribbon hidden. Mira's last words were precise: document everything. No private removals. Jonas' fingers twitched and he said, "Elias, be careful." Anna closed the vault door, and the sound of the bolt sliding home became the closing beat. Outside the vault, the corridor lamps hummed. Elias kept his face steady. In his pocket, the ribbon dampened his fingers. The preservation compromise stood. The object was contained and the record existed. The scene's small victory felt partial. He felt the final emotion as a functional aftertaste, unease sharpened into resolve. He had evidence to study and a private item that would complicate his ethics. He tucked the ribbon further beneath his signet ring. The chapter ended on that concrete beat. Elias turned the corridor corner and heard Mira call the accession number aloud as she completed the quarantine log. He did not look back. The vault alarm cut through the night as black ink crawled from the grimoire's gutter and pooled on the stone. Suspicion tightened Elias' throat. He moved before he named the danger. Jonah Reed shouted, "It's moving," and the sound landed like a thrown object between the vault racks. Miriam Hale shoved past with a lantern and Lucia Varr followed with gloved hands, both faces pale in the lantern halo. Within those first breaths the problem was visible. A bound book had begun to alter its immediate surroundings and the people who touched it. Elias stepped into the vault's lower chamber and smelled paper and cold metal. He was 40, 8 lean hair streaked with grey, and his hands were already ink, stained from cataloguing marginalia. There was no ceremony in his movement, only a practiced urgency. He did not ask for explanations. He took the nearest photograph, and the camera's red recording light blinked. The alarm kept a steady, thin cry, "Elias, look at the gutter." Jonah. His hands trembled enough that the photographs blurred. Jonas' voice carried the same stripped panic from earlier nights when he had burst in with a palm codex. This time the threat was larger. Jonah held up the picture. Black filaments had crept out of the book and formed a shallow, wet edge on the flagstone. Elias crouched and listened to the ink as if it might speak. He did not hear words. He heard a faint, wet shifting and the vault fan's strained breath. Suspicion pushed him to test the obvious boundary. He reached for a gloved corner of vellum and drew his fingertip along a margin. The ink retracted, like a muscle pulling away when touched. He straightened and said, "Containment protocol now. Cradle metal, no fiber contact." His voice was measured, his actions rapid. Miriam moved to the containment locker and began unlocking with the code. Lucia carried the open metal crate on a wheeled cart. Jonah described every visual detail while Elias photographed a ledger stitched into the spine. The team's motions were short, precise, a choreography born of training. Yet the ink undermined each move. It pooled on stone and then climbed the wheel of the cart in narrow tendrils. "It's crawling the metal," Lucia reported. She balanced the crate while Jonah tried to slide the book inside. Dante touched the lid, Elias warned, and then, because orders carry weight only when specific, he added, "Slide. Do not lift." Use the glass plate. He found the small brass magnifier in his satchel and set it beside the cart as an improvised shield for the gutter. They attempted the crate maneuver 3 times. On the second try, a filament found a hairline seam and threaded along the lip. The ink pooled against the crate's interior and darkened the rivet heads. Jonah cursed and stepped back. Miriam's palm hit the metal and she flinched. The contact left a faint stain on her glove. The team froze for milliseconds and operated again. The containment attempt failed when the ink climbed the crate's outer seam and spread across Jonah's sleeve. The fabric darkened and a wet circle formed where the ink met wool. The crate's lid clanged shut too late. Lucia shoved the cart away with both hands and the book slipped, striking the inside wall of the crate with a dull thud. The thud echoed and Jonah gasped. The alarm had been a warning. Their procedure was not sufficient. Elias barked one sentence orders: secure the corridor. Turn off the ventilation to the vault. Photograph everything. His body remained controlled while his mind ran through ancient binding techniques and modern containment standards. Suspicion shifted to urgency. He did not ask the team to imagine danger. He asked them to act against it. They moved to the antechamber and propped a metal door against the corridor entrance. Jonah set up a tripod for remote shots. Miriam unwrapped a cotton bandage to test if the ink would soak a fabric sample. Lucia wore additional nitrile gloves and adjusted her lamp. For a moment the group looked like a small, wired machine of response. Miriam's hand slipped as she steadied the crate. The bandage she held brushed the inside edge, and a thin thread of ink found the paper cut on her palm. She bit the inside of her cheek and did not cry out. The ink darkened under the skin in a small circle, then a shape, an angular sigil, fanned into view beneath the flesh. Miriam's face went pale and she gripped the crate rim until her knuckles whitened. Elias watched the mark form under her skin. He put a hand on her shoulder. "Show me," he said. Miriam peeled back the glove. The cut looked ordinary until Elias angled the lantern, and the sigil appeared as if pressed beneath epidermis. He felt his pulse pick up. Fear arrived not as a mood but as a tightening in his fingers and a focused calculation in his mind. He barked, "Lucia, iodine swabs. Now, Jonas, document the wound and the time. Do not bandage until photographed." The team's responses were clipped and immediate. Lucia dabbed the cut with iodine. The stain did not repel the swab. The skin underneath remained unchanged, the sigil steady. Miriam swallowed, then spoke in a line of clipped words. "It feels numb. I can feel anything below my wrist." Jonah snapped more photographs and murmured timestamps. Elias listened to their voices for logical patterns. When Miriam's hand twitched, he took that twitch as a data point. He watched the way she pressed her thumb against the wound. He instructed, "Hold still. Breathe with me." He offered nothing sentimental. He routed his attention to containment and to what the ledger might reveal. Suspicion shifted to a clinical fear that required data. While they treated Miriam, Jonah moved along the grimoire's spine and found a folded folio hidden in the binding. He pulled at a discreet stitch and a small ledger fell free. It was bound in older vellum, the stitching hand soon and finer than the grimoire's modern rebinding. Jonah's hands trembled as he opened the ledger and a lock of hair fell out, wrapped in a square of linen, and soon into the spine a hair. "Jonah." He sounded incredulous and a little afraid. Someone put hair into the binding. The ledger's marginalia were in a different hand, older, and the lines were dense with notation and calculations. Elias took the ledger and turned pages with deliberate reverence. The marginal words were perfunctory names, dates, small ritual lists, but one entry gave Elias a cold clarity. The notation described a deliberate practice of stitching Adonis' tissue into the binding to tether a ritual to a human anchor. Elias' jaw tightened. He held the ledger so Lucia and Miriam could see. "This was engineered," he said. "It is not a passive manuscript. It was made to live with someone as part of the book." His voice stayed even. Jonah's breath hitched. The discovery changed everything. A concealed ledger, soon hair, and old hands notations, those elements suggested intention and malice rather than random superstition. The team argued in short, clipped lines. "We should sever the spine, Lucia, break the binding, stop the pattern. We risk more contamination," Jonah countered. "If we break the spine, fragments could escape, or the mechanism could trigger with exposure. We don't know that consequences, Miriam quietly, are already here." She lifted her other hand and showed the slow darkening that had begun to spread along her wrist. Elias put his palm flat on the ledger blank back cover. He weighed the two options. He thought of preservation ethics and of the ledger's note that described binding a living will. He thought of past nights when Jonah had burst in with a moving codex and the lab doors slammed. Those memories were concrete, Jonah's raw voice, the smear of ink that had crawled across the margin, and they formed the basis for his choice. He made a decision in seconds. He chose to attempt a controlled severing of the binding, hoping to stop the active sigils from communicating through the spine. "We cut at the stitch line," he said. "Lucia, brace the cover. Jonah, remote camera. Miriam, watch the wrist and be ready to cuff if we need to compress the vein." The order came out of habit and training. They worked with surgical brevity. Lucia wedged wooden shims under the cover to stabilize the folio. Jonah started the remote camera. Elias produced a slim bone folder and a craft scalpel. He slid the scalpel into the stitch line and began to cut. The cut was clean and precise at first. Then the ledger shuddered under his hand as if tiny muscles flexed within its pages. A bloom of darkness erupted from the spine, not smoke but a tight, circular pulse of dimness that hung above the crate. The vault lights flickered and the emergency bulbs flashed red. Lucius' knees buckled. Jonah stepped back and dropped the tripod head so his camera swung on its mount like an injured thing. Elias felt a pressure in his ears and an instinctive urge to clamp the book closed. He forced his hand to steady. A voice from his memory, older catalog notes, told him that some bindings employed sympathetic irritation to anchor a ritual. He had not expected the reaction to be physical. The bloom pulsed outward and the air tasted metallic. Miriam's breathing stuttered. The sigil beneath her skin seemed to pulse with the bloom. Elias had seconds to choose. Break the spine entirely or seal the vault and risk later dissemination. He looked at each face. Lucius' expression had gone flat. Jonah's mouth was open. Miriam's fingers trembled. He thought of the ledger's soon hair and realized that breaking the spine might release whatever had been tethered. He also realized that sealing the vault might contain it, but leave a living anchor inside a box. He acted. He snapped the scalpel through the remaining thread and used the bone folder to close the cover. He then slammed the crate lid shut and pushed the lock bar into place with both palms. Metal met metal. The pulse crashed against the lid in a sound like a muted drum. The air in the antechamber cooled. Jonah dropped to his knees and pressed his forehead to the concrete. Lucia coughed and tried to stand. Miriam leaned against the containment locker and stared at her wrist. Jonah's camera still whirred on the tripod, recording. In the silence after the bloom, Elias realized Lucia had collapsed entirely and lay breathing shallowly on the floor. Her glove bore a dark mark that had spread across her palm like a map. Emergency protocols kicked in. Elias ordered a quarantine and called security on the vault line. He flagged the ledger and recorded chain of custody details on the inventory sheet with a hand that shook only once. Then he found Jonah's freckled wrist in the lantern's light and caught Jonah sliding a small torn folio edge into his pocket. The movement was slight. Jonah thought he had not been seen. Elias did not speak at first. He observed Jonah's fingers fold the paper into the pocket. He watched the camera lens still facing the sealed crate, and then he stepped closer. "Jonah," he said quietly, and the name carried. Jonah looked up. The color drained from his face. Jonah started. "Show me your hands, Elias." Jonah pulled out the scrap and held it up. It was a tiny strip of vellum with cramped marginalia and a fleck of dark residue on the edge. Jonah's eyes were wide and raw. "Why did you take that, Elias?" Jonah swallowed. "I thought I could study it alone. I thought I could figure out how it moved. I thought," his voice broke. Miriam's eyes pressed focus on Jonah. "You took it out of the crate," she said. Her tone was small like a snapped wire. Jonah nodded, unable to meet Elias's gaze. The room tasted like iron. Elias felt something colder than the vault stone then. Betrayal. Not a sweeping moral collapse, but a specific wound located in Jonah's furtive movement. Betrayal shifted the group's dynamics. Elias had to convert that emotion into action. "Give it to me. Now, on the table." "Open your palm," Jonah, hands shaking, placed the scrap between two sheets of photographic glass. Elias photographed the scrap at multiple exposures. He instructed security to search Jonah's bag. Jonah protested in short lines, "You endangered the team." "Jonah, Elias, you know the protocol. You know why we quarantine." The words were plain. Jonah's reply came out as a single, ragged line. "I wanted answers, Elias. I wanted to know why it moved. You wanted to touch it alone." Elias finished. Jonah nodded and tears tracked along his cheeks. The argument had 3 rapid exchanges where Jonah for leniency and Elias insisted on procedure. Security arrived and sealed the corridor. Lucia was carried out on a stretcher under emergency lights. Miriam would be tested. Her cut was stable, but the sigil was not fading. The crate remained sealed in the vault. Elias watched the doors close and felt the temporary safety of a metal barrier. He returned to the reading table alone in the locked special collections room. He set the photograph sequence beside the ledger index and reviewed the ledger's older hand for context. The ledger's marginalia linked several dispersed entries to a name he recognized from old access lists. A collector who had traded in crafted manuscripts that acted as ritual nodes. The discovery reframed prior incidents. Jonah's earlier alarm with the palm-sized codex, the ink that crawled across margins, those were not isolated oddities, but part of a deliberate practice. Elias spread the images of the bloom on the tabletop and traced the sequence with a gloved finger. He felt the moral weight of the knight's choice. The book had been sealed, but Jonah's theft had shifted unknown risk into their circle. Elias remembered the ledger's note that the sewn hair anchored a human subject and that separation might injure the anchor. He felt a tightness at the base of his throat and set the ledger down. He compiled notes with care. He wrote times, descriptors, and the exact wording of the ledger's binding instructions. He recorded Lucia's collapse, Miriam's wound, Jonah's theft. Each concrete line on the inventory would be evidence and a warning. He resolved to document the mechanism that had made knowledge dangerous and to prepare for the fallout. Before dawn, he catalogued photographs again and cross-referenced names in the ledger with historic access logs. A pattern emerged: households, abandoned rooms, and a string of small deaths recorded as respiratory failure in the old lists matched the ledger's entries. The ledger had been used as a living instrument of harm. Elias did not sleep. He sat at the solitary table and sketched a map of the ledger's provenance. He felt resolve, not a rhetorical desire, but the concrete impulse to secure records and to prevent further contact. He typed a secure notice to special collections staff, flagged the ledger for restricted research, and included the chain of custody notes. He placed his silver signet ring on the ledger and left it there, a quiet, physical marker of his custodial claim. He opened the crate photograph sequence one last time and noticed a detail his initial shock had missed. A faint fingerprint in the gutter margin, partial and smeared, matching Jonah's right index. Jonah had not been careless. He had been the binding's most recent handler. The fingerprint shifted the case into a new register of culpability and necessity. Elias rose as the prayer dawn washed the library windows faintly gray. He packed his pocket journal, the brass magnifier, and the ledger's duplicate photographs. He closed the Ledger Est folder and placed it inside a sealed archival bag. He walked to the vault door and watched security personnel verify seals. Jonah sat on a bench outside, hands clasped, head bowed. Miriam walked by, supported by 2 colleagues, her wrist bandaged but eyes fixed on the floor. Elias paused at the corridor threshold and, in a line of action rather than reflection, pressed his palm to the sealed crate's cold metal. He felt the texture of rivets under his skin and the residual chill of the vault. He could not undo his choice. He had chosen containment with a broken spine rather than release. The ledger was closed for now. The quarantine held. He left a single instruction on the locked reading table. Secure the ledger, monitor Jonah, and prepare for a formal review at first light. Then he stepped into the pale morning and did not speak. The day's duties would carry the night forward. He had documented the mechanism, restrained the immediate threat, and an uneasy knowledge remained. Containment was temporary and human choices could undo it. He took the ledger photographs under his arm and walked toward the archive elevator with a small, practical finality. The quarantine door clanged shut behind him. The junior conservator yanked the folio open, and black ink crawled across her wrist. Suspicion tightened Elias's jaw the way a ligament catches under strain. He moved before he named the danger. "Jonah, hold her hand." He snapped, and Jonah Reed stepped forward, fingers trembling as he pressed a linen rag against the ink spreading over pale skin. The conservator hissed and yanked her arm free. The ink left a wet, glossy ribbon on the table and a thin, dark film on her skin that would not be wiped clean. Elias felt suspicion shift into alarm as he forced a lid back onto the codex and wrapped it in treated linen. He had handled marginal stains before, but never one that crossed flesh and clung. He had seen Jonah burst into the corridor once before with a palm codex itching across its margin, and he had listened to a vault alarm cut through the stacks on a night when ink pooled on stone. Those stiffened moments pressed against him now and shaped his next moves. He set the wrapped folio on the workbench and rid the room by its sounds. Jonah breathed like a man trying to stop himself from vomiting. Miriam Hale stood with her arms folded and a fresh scrape of disapproval on her face. The junior conservator cupped her wrist and watched Elias with a wide, untrusting gaze. What happened? Head archivist Celine Ward's voice arrived from the doorway, clipped and precise. She had come when the security officer paged her. The locked stack's wing always drew her. Elias heard the weight of institutional reputation in her tone. He kept his hand on the wrapped codex as if that contact steadied an argument. Elias answered in short, controlled sentences because action had to outpace speculation. The ink moved across the page and onto skin. It adhered. It won't come off. He did not say the word curse. He did not have to. Celine's eyes darted to the wrapped folio, then to the conservator's wrist. Suspicion, rooting the chapter, drove Elias to insist on containment. "Quarantine," he said. "Lock it in the isolation chest." No photographs, no notes beyond forensic sampling. He pronounced those steps with the authority of someone who had watched manuscripts harm people before, and his insistence forced a decision. Celine hesitated and then nodded. "Cataloging will wait," she said. "We call security and preservation." They moved with measured urgency. Security Officer Reeves arrived in a plain jacket and carried a radio clipped to his belt. He set plastic isolation gloves on the bench and put the junior conservator through a quick set of instructions. Wash with distilled water, apply binding gel, keep the wound covered. The conservator's lips trembled when she spoke. "It burned when the ink touched me," she said. Her voice stayed small. "It felt like a stitch under my skin." Elias leaned close and took the wrist from her carefully, fingers brushing the dark film. He felt a prick of anger, another emotion shift, as he thought of professional duty conflicting with public liability. "Show me where it rose," he said. The conservator turned her hand. Under the glossy film an almost invisible pattern had begun to form. A ring of tiny stitches in the flesh, not a stain but a relief, as if the skin had been embroidered from within. Outside the room, Jonah muttered. Jonah Reed burst into the corridor earlier and shoved the codex into my hands, and the phrase snagged Elias. He remembered the earlier night. Jonah's breathless warning, the guttering vellum under a lantern, ink that crawled like a living thing. He would not let those earlier details be only a memory now. They circled the present and made every decision more urgent. "Jonah, you brought it into the seminar." "Celine." Jonah nodded, jaw tight. "Yes. I thought it was one of the marginalia jokes at first. Then it moved across the page here," he said, pointing, and then he stopped. Miriam held a small magnifier and leaned in. Miriam Hale's voice carried an edge of accusation. "You should have reported it at once, Jonah. Not brought it to a group of students." She had been in the preservation room when the vault alarm had sounded in a previous incident, and the memory sharpened her tone now. Jonah's shoulders tightened, and he answered in short bursts. I didn't want it locked away. I wanted Elias to look. Elias, you have to see this. The room split into decisions. Celine wondered about quarantine procedures and the archive's liability. Reeves wanted to remove the codex and take it to central storage. Elias pressed his palm flat against the wrapped folio and said, We open only for forensic sampling and only in isolation. Miriam, prepare the lab. Reeves, lock the door and station a guard. Celine, sign the form I will draft. No one else touches it. He spoke quickly so the tape of protocol would bind them to action. They performed tasks with precise motions, washing, bandaging, cataloging, while the codex waited on the bench in its wound of linen. In the preservation lab, Miriam ran a light through the folio's vellum and noted an irregularity on the spine. There's metallic thread, she said. See here. Embedded under the pasta down, she eased a micro tool along the sewing and lifted a fragment of corroded wire that glinted like old coin. Elias felt anger curdle into something more searching. The metal suggested manufacture. The metal and the hair paste they found beneath the vellum suggested human intent. Miriam lifted a sliver of dark fiber from under the skin glue and handed it to Elias with steady fingers. Human hair, she said, old, treated. Whoever bound this did more than bind pages. Her voice was a scalpel. Jonah leaned in, whispering. The margin had stitches, not ink stitches, actual thread under the parchment. I thought my eyes were failing. He touched his own fingertips as if they might be ink, stained. Elias watched Jonah's hands and thought of Jonah's habit of thrusting a codex at him in the corridor. The habit now looked less like curiosity and more like involvement. Elias's suspicion hardened into resolve. He barked orders for samples to be taken for metallurgical analysis and for hair to be carbon dated. They photographed everything under controlled light. Celine sat at a small table with the logbook and signed each containment entry as the law required. Her pen moved in careful strokes, each signature a legal fence. As technicians ran swabs and recorded data, Elias peeled back the linen and opened the codex on a glass cradle. Candlelight would not be allowed near the sample, so the lab lights gave a stinging white instead of a warm ritual glow. The folio's margin held more than ink. Tiny, dense handwriting squeezed into the gutter, and a repeated motif stitched into the parchment with a fine dark thread. Elias read aloud, voice low because his habit was to speak marginalia into being. For the donor who signed the pledge, let the oath cling. He looked up, it names a donor. It repeats a signet I recognize. He set his glasses on the bridge of his nose and held the line of script under a lens. The script mirrored the faint emblem on his own silver signet ring, an orb crossed by two small bars. His hand found the ring as if to steady himself. The room tightened. Celine's face drained color. Miriam's jaw dropped. Jonah's hands trembled openly. Now, alias, Celine, are you saying this book names you? He did not answer immediately because his chest had become a place for logic to pass through. Panels of his past work slid out. Catalogue bindings with poisons in the glue, marginalia used as formulas, recipes for ritual craft disguised as herbal notes. He thought of the vault alarm, of Jonah's cry, of the ink pooling on stone. It references a donor and reproduces a signet similar to mine, he said. I need to confirm the cipher, but the layout is deliberate. This book is aimed at someone. Fear arrived for the first time as a fast, physical thing. A tightness at the back of his throat, a metallic quickening in his palms. He swallowed and forced action again. Keep the sample isolated. Contact Jutta Patel for a cipher read. Seal the lab. No one posts about this. No one talks to the press. He spoke to control the spread of the event. They worked through a tense night. At one point Jonah shouted, "It's stitched. You can see where the thread starts here at the outer margin and goes into the binding." He had the magnifier and several lamps, and he forced the group to look at the binding detail. It goes under the spine, like a tether. His voice carried the mini cliffhanger of discovery. the idea that the book had been designed to reach out beyond pages. Miriam stopped him with a controlled hand motion. "Stop talking like that, Jonah. Describe it precisely." She carried the preservationist discipline into speech. The thread enters the binding at folio 3 and terminates under the pastor down, where there's a small cavity filled with adhesive and hair. We should treat that cavity as an intentional deposit. Celine closed the logbook and said, "If this was intentional, we need counsel. This crosses into criminal evidence." "Reeves, get a chain of custody ready." Reeves nodded and moved to lock the corridor. He barked into his radio and then slowed his pace, as if the place itself resisted haste. Elias's fear hardened into anger when the ink, so stubbornly present on the conservator's wrist, left a faint red mark that matched the ring's outline. He looked at his silver signet and then at the page. "It knows my ring," he said. "It knows my imprint. Whoever made this had access to my seal." He kept his voice low. The accusation hung in the room like a challenge. They debated provenance. Jonah argued that the codex could be a relic of a grudge. Some binder had sewn a name into a binding and set a curse. Miriam insisted on methodical forensics. Celine worried about the archive's insurance. Elias listened and then pushed for a deeper material revelation. "We need to test metal composition and look for isotopes that might place the wire within a workshop. Carbon dating the hair should give us a range. If the donor was living, the hair could link to a known set of samples." He spoke in terms of evidence, because evidence could guide action. The forensic tests produced an unexpected twist. The metallic thread contained a rare alloy used in late 14th century fasteners, but its corrosion pattern included traces of a later solder. The hair, when examined under the microscope, bore signs of modern treatment. Initially contradictory, the results suggested an object assembled across centuries. Historic components reused and reconfigured with recent additions. Elias felt one more emotion shift, from anger to a cold, studious curiosity that propelled him into research mode. He called Jonah to recount an earlier detail he had not voiced. "Jonah, the night you found the codex, did anyone else handle it before you brought it to the corridor?" Jonah's eyes flicked to the ceiling as if counting names. "Miriam handled it first that day in the vault Isel," he said. "She took it out and set it on a cart because she thought it needed consolidation. Then I saw the margin move. Then it got passed between us." Miriam's posture stiffened. "I touched only the outer cover. I did not open the idiom. I left it wrapped when I moved it." Her voice was minimal but firm. Elias noted the contrast in speech rhythms, Jonah's quick confessions and Miriam's measured denials. The contrast told him more than any single statement. He moved to the conservation bench and raised the magnifier to the stitched note. The cipher had been worked into the parchment with a fine needle. Each tiny stitch was an exact coordinate. He traced the pattern with a gloved finger and felt an odd pull, a tactile clue rather than a sensation of dread. The stitches spelled a name if read with the correct key. Elias felt the pull of a personal motive tightening the scene. Someone had named a living donor and stitched a signet motif to force attention. Celine demanded a consult with legal counsel before the archive made any public record. "We lock it and wait for counsel," she said. Her voice tried to stop him from diving deeper. Elias felt the obligation to obey protocol bump against his conviction that this book required a cautious but immediate investigation. He made a decision that would change the course of his work. He photographed the stitched motif at 11 p.m., made a microfilm copy of the folio in secret, and hid the microfilm in his satchel. Jonah watched, face pale and open. "Elias, what are you doing?" Jonah hissed. "You can't just take things." He had been an assistant in the vault when the alarm had sounded the earlier night. His memory of alarms and ink made him fear unauthorized actions. Elias met Jonah's gaze and kept his voice low. "If it's meant to bind someone, it will be preserved by law. If it is meant to harm that someone, preservation could become containment. I will not let it be destroyed until we know what it does. I will pursue provenance quietly. Jonah protested with rapid-fire lines. You should Celine will fire us. Reeves will arrest you. This is not how we do archives. The argument rose in quick, clipped exchanges. Miriam's voice interjected with 3 short lines of practical counterpoint. We need a chain of custody. We need to test the solder. We need to document every hand that touched this codex. The argument crystallized into a confrontation that forced choices. Celine looked at Elias with the calm of someone who had to make decisions for the whole institution. If this is a risk, we destroy it under controlled conditions. If it is evidence, we hand it to the authorities. You cannot take archive property. Elias heard the terms and made a move that stunned everyone. He unhooked his signet ring and placed it on the table next to the folio. If the book calls for a donor, let it name me. Let it prove it knows my ring. His voice had a flat, almost reckless clarity. Silence followed, because a ring on the table was a tangible wager. Jonah's mouth hung open. Miriam's shoulders went rigid. Celine's face registered a calculation, and then a practical concession. You will not contact the press. You will remain under supervision. If you deviate, we will hand everything to council. She signed the consent form to keep the codex in the archive under strict custody and left a conditional permission for Elias to consult the material, provided he submitted written plans. Elias swallowed a different sort of fear and set his ring back on his finger. The stinging mark on the conservator's wrist glinted in the lab light like a seal. When they attempted to move the codex into a sealed chest later that night, the ink erupted once more. It spread across the table surface and shot toward Elias' hand as if tracking the metal. It struck his signet ring and left a shallow, hot sting on the skin beneath. He grabbed the ring with his gloved palm and tried to pull his hand back. Jonah and Reeves lunged. Miriam shoved a gloved hand between Elias' wrist and the codex. The ink lashed into the ring and seared into metal. Elias clenched his teeth and fought the sudden, sharp sensory surge that felt like a burn and the press of something binding under his skin. 3 people struggled around the bench in controlled, urgent motions.
Jonah shouted, "Get it off him!
Get it off him!"
Reeves barked into his radio and shoved a gloved hand inside the lid to pry the codex away. Miriam gripped Elias' shoulder to steady him. The physicality of the scene kept them from falling into rhetoric. Hands, pulls, the scrape of gloves, the ring caught on skin, the wet smear of ink on the bench. They finally managed to wedge a metal spatula between the ring and the page and pry the hand away. Elias staggered, breathing through the pain. He set his hand on the bench and looked down. Around his ring there was now a faint red pattern under the skin, an imprint of tiny stitches, like the conservator's but fainter. It did not wash away. Elias tried to speak, but the words were thin. "It's marked me," he said. "It's marked me under the skin." Miriam checked his finger for burns and muttered the technical observations doctors would later record. Superficial dermal abrasion, localized erythema. She wrapped his hand and applied a saline dressing with methodical motions. The aftershock was procedural and human at once. Celine ordered the chest sealed and insisted that the codex be moved to isolation under watch. Reeves set 2 guards. Miriam drafted forensic notes. Jonah sat against the wall and let his head slump into his hands. They had contained the object. They had not contained its effect. In the dawn's first light, Elias sat alone at an empty reading table in the locked stacks corridor. He unwrapped the microfilm from its packet and slid it into a small reader, watching his hands tremble very slightly. He thought of the stitched marginalia naming a donor, of the metallic thread and the hair paste, of the way the ink had reached for him. Each fact pushed him from suspicion into a stubborn, private vow. He would trace the book's provenance himself. He turned the microfilm over in his palm and slid it into a secret pocket in his satchel. Jonah looked up from the bench and saw the motion. "Elias." Jonah began, but Elias cut him off gently. "Keep the chain intact in public, Elias. But I will follow this outside formal channels. I cannot hand it over until I know who it was meant for and why. His voice had the soft, unyielding quality of a man who understood both law and danger. Jonah nodded because he understood the angle of obsession, and because he had seen Elias stitch himself to cases before. I'll come with you, Jonah. If Celine fires you, I'll be the one to pick through the boxes with you. Elias smiled a small, tired smile and closed the satchel. He stood, feeling the bandage hug his finger and the hidden microfilm warm against his side. Celine's footsteps sounded in the corridor as she returned with the chest key. She placed the key on the table and looked at Elias. One condition, she said. You keep me informed. You do not break the archive's laws. If you step outside this, we will move everything to council. The warning sat on the table like a verdict. Elias picked up the key, took the microfilm, and slipped both back into his satchel. He fastened the satchel strap over his shoulder, felt the weight of the ring on his finger, and left the corridor with Jonah at his side. In the preservation wing, Miriam watched them go and rubbed her palms, as if pushing sleep from her skin. They had resolved the night's immediate conflict. The codex would remain in sealed custody, Elias would be allowed limited access, and he had made a quiet, personal vow to pursue the book's origin. The chapter closed on a concrete, situational beat. Elias tucking the microfilm into his satchel as Celine snapped the chest shut and handed him the key with a warning look. The wound on his finger throbbed, and the faint stitch under his skin would not be erased. Emotion root. Suspicion had guided Elias from the initial event. It shifted to alarm when the ink reached skin, then to anger over potential manipulation, and finally to resolve and obsession to discover the provenance. Those shifts played out through actions, commands, tests, a secret microfilm, and through short, clipped dialogue that forced other characters to choose. Jonah, Miriam, and Celine each influenced the course. Jonah's discovery escalated the danger, Miriam's forensics revealed design, and Celine's stewardship imposed institutional boundaries. The chapter ends with a clear decision and a small but decisive risk. Elias keeps a copy and vows to trace the oath soon into the margins. The codex waits in its sealed chest. The mark on his finger will not fade. And the question that started the night remains concrete and immediate. Who stitched his signet into a binding, and what debt was the book designed to enforce? A wax-sealed folio landed on Elias's desk with the seal split and dark ink seeping beneath it. Jonah staggered in behind the courier, clinging to the codex as the stain crawled toward his sleeve. Suspicion tightened Elias's jaw. He reached for the book before Miriam could speak. Put it down, Jonah, Elias, and his voice was flat enough to stop the courier. Jonah's hand trembled. The stain pulsed once like something trying to find a seam. Elias set the folio on the reading table and slid the containment screen into place. He kept his hand near his pocket journal. In the first minutes, suspicion drove him to act rather than argue paperwork. He had watched ink move in a vault. He had lifted a palm-sized codex from Jonah once before, fingers soaked in black lines. Tonight, those earlier facts made his choices mechanical. Isolate, examine, limit contact. Jonah, sit. Breathe, Miriam ordered. Jonah sank on a stool and bared his wrist. The ink had spread up his palm in thin veins. It's moving, Jonah. The word landed in the room like a thrown object. Jonah's eyelids fluttered. He coughed. The junior conservator hovered with gloved hands, eyes fixed on the margins where fresh sigils bled across illuminated letters. Elias felt the old catalogue of dangers align in his chest. He could not let institutional inertia override a clear hazard. Elias worked quickly. He wore his round spectacles and set the brass magnifier on a padded rest. He did not narrate his motions, he moved them. He slid the folio open with both hands and exposed a margin no one in the library records had catalogued. Cramped, frantic script wrapped around a painted dragon and then a ritual clause. The clause read like a contract. Elias read aloud, slow and controlled, so the team could verify his transcription. By witness and reader, the word binds the thing until wax and signet mark complete, he said. Miriam and Jonah exchanged looks. The clause made containment a moral choice. Miriam leaned close. "This says it needs an oath," she said. Her voice had a brittle edge Elias recognized from other difficult conservation calls. He had seen that edge when she argued for restraint in the preservation room. He had seen Jonah Hass panic in the vault. The book forced a decision everyone in the room could feel tugging at the practical rules of the archive. The head archivist arrived at a hard step through the doorway. He stopped in the corridor with his coat collar up and a list of tomorrow's requests in his hands. "You will not destroy a folio that belongs to the collection," he said, naming duty and policy before he named danger. Alias' chest tightened into a new shape: conflict. Institutional duty pressed against immediate safety. Elias' suspicion shifted to frustration. "We are not proposing destruction, Elias. We are proposing controlled containment or neutralization until we can assess the clause. The marginal ink is active. Jonah has the mark. This is not a cataloging question." Elias kept his sentences short. He had a habit of doing that in arguments. It kept the room from dissolving into rhetoric. "Jonah, show me your hand." "Miriam, seal the crate blankets." "Jonah's," he paused and corrected himself out loud. "Jonah." Dante moved toward the stacks. "Do not take the book into the collections." The archivist's eyes were calm in a way Elias had learned to mistrust. "This is part of our responsibility." The archivist. "We catalog, we preserve, we make the material available to scholars." "You are overreacting." The archivist's voice tightened at the end, a sign Elias noted. This was policy cloaked as principle. Miriam's jaw set. Jonah's fingers clenched in a way that made the dark lines on his palm darken. Jonah shoved to his feet. The ink had climbed to his wrist. "I can hide it in the stacks," he blurted. "It'll lose itself in the shelves. No one will find it. It'll stop." Jonah's suggestion was both a panic move and a calculation. He wanted to rid himself of the thing. He feared the mark. His action forced Miriam to move first. She stepped between Jonah and the doorway and put both hands on his forearm. "Jonah, stop." "Miriam, you want to take it into the stacks. You want to let it spread." Her hands were steady. Elias watched her crack the book's cover slightly with gloved fingers to peer deeper into the illuminated folio. The marginalia had shifted. Where a painted vine had been, a sigil had unfurled. The sigil's pigment lay wet and black like pooled oil. Jonah's breath came fast. Elias felt a second emotional gear shift, from suspicion to a rising fear measured in concrete actions: clenched hands, a ringed finger curling, a foot tapping. Miriam and Elias ran the options aloud: seal and submit to the head's approval. The archivist suggested quarantine under lock and catalog in place. Neutralize with solvent and heat. The junior conservator offered, voice small, that might damage the text. It might complete the clause. Jonah's lips shaped a sound that was not entirely a sob. They argued quickly. Policy versus immediate safety, preservation versus the risk of ritual completion. The room filled with short sentences and names. The debate forced the team to lay out possible outcomes. 3 events happened in quick succession. The junior conservator's gloved hand slipped on the book's lower corner, and a bead of ink lifted off the page like a drop. The bead fell to the table and flattened without drying. Jonah lunged and Miriam reached, catching his wrist. The bead crawled toward the seam of the page, and against the grain, connected 2 letters into a new ligature. The small movement altered the clause's sense. A fresh imperative appeared. Elias' throat closed. He read the shifted line aloud. "When witness fails to bind, the book seeks witness of its own." That sentence shifted understanding. The manuscript did not merely require human participation. It could recruit it. It recruits. Miriam, it can make someone into a witness if left unchecked. Her voice had a different tone now. The fear in it was precise. The book could expand the roster of participants by forcing gestures or inciting movement. Jonah's hand spasmed. The ink had crept to his knuckle and formed a ring-shaped mark beneath his signet. Elias checked his own silver signet ring without thinking, as if habits could protect him. The ring bore the faded sigil, that matched the wax on the folio's broken seal. He had worn that ring for years. It had been in his family for generations. The ring's flat surface was scratched, its engraving dulled. He realized in a single, hard second that his ring's symbol was the same glyph that now circled Jonas' palm. A new twist registered. The book's binding ritual referenced a lineage of signets. Elias felt anger and guilt and betrayal braid together into a single action. He removed his ring with care and placed it on the padded table next to the codex. Elias, Miriam, voice low, "Why is his mark like your ring?" Elias' fingers trembled as he placed the ring. He could not say when he had last opened his father's study or what lineage paperwork the ring had sat beside. But he knew catalogue records. He knew the long shadow of acquisitions. He could not yet explain how the ring matched the wax, but the match made the problem personal. The head archivist moved closer. "You are making reckless choices. That ring is museum property, is it not? Where did you obtain it?" The archivist's hand hovered above the crate. "The record should show provenance." "We cannot let rumor dictate conservation." The archivist's words were policy forms pressed against a live threat. He did not speak of Jonas' hand. His argument tried to reframe the room into paperwork. Jonas' breathing grew shallow. He held the book with both hands and rocked as if to calm himself. "I didn't mean to, Jonah." He stopped. Miriam tightened her grip. "Jonah, look at me. Breathe with me. 1, 2, 3, she counted out loud. Jonas' jaw worked. A bead of ink on his thumb suddenly lifted and retreated from the skin. The movement was immediate and bodily. Elias realized emotion had shifted again. From fear into focused resolve. The team moved from arguing to acting. They chose containment with ritual mimicry as a calculated gamble. Elias read the clause aloud while Miriam and Jonah enacted the gestures described in the marginalia. He announced each required motion. Jonah, press the book's corner. Miriam, hold the waxed cloth. I will speak the binding terms. He kept his voice steady. The three of them formed a human seal. The junior conservator backed away to stand by the crate. The archivist watched with an expression Elias read as thin patience and thin fear. As Elias spoke the clause words, the manuscript reacted. The ink on the page pulsed like a small living thing. Jonah's fingers found a painted knot and squeezed. Miriam pressed a gloved palm over the broken seal while Elias pronounced the final infinitive. The room filled with a sharp metallic scent and an electrical tick that raised gooseflesh on Jonas' forearm. A resinous wax began to bleed from the book's spine. Elias's signet ring warmed where he had placed it on the table. He watched the ring's engraving glow faintly, and then dull as the book drew part of the ring's heat into its binding. Halfway through the clause, the manuscript resisted. The ink recoiled, then lunged across 2 lines of text, forming a vertical mark that pierced the clause's grammar. Voices rose. Jonah gasped. Miriam cursed. The archivist barked in order to stop. Elias kept speaking. He shortened the syllables to blunt units. He had to finish the structure. The team's actions became a sequence of rehearsed moves. Jonas's pressure, Miriam's seal, Elias reading. The junior conservator moved to hold the table's padding. The book pulled and the wax hardened in the shape of a crude seal stamped with the ring's outline. The ritual completed imperfectly. The binding took, but it took flesh as well as wax. Jonah collapsed into a seated slump. His palm bore a shallow, smoky gouge formed in the pattern of Elias' ring. The ring itself had a fresh scorch line. Elias checked Jonah's pulse. It was present and weak. Miriam unlatched the crate and began to pack the folio into a double layer of treated cloth. The head archivist barked the inventory code and wrote in a thin hand, "Log this as Incident 37, he said. He used the bureaucratic language of containment, because that language allowed him to avoid naming what had happened, that a human hand now matched an object's sigil. They sealed the crate with a resinous wax and placed a second, lead line box within. The junior conservator recorded humidity and temperature. Jonah stared at his bleeding palm and then at Elias. "It burns," he said. "It won't stop at night. Elias felt guilt press into his mouth. He thought of earlier vault nights when he had stood between a rush of crawling ink and a line of ancient shelves. He thought of his decision to read the clause aloud, of how his voice had been the final instrument to complete the book's demand. He moved to Jonah and placed a hand on his shoulder, careful not to touch the mark. The contact was an anchor, a deliberate, unpoetic human touch. Jonah flinched and then leaned into it. Dawn came with a practical sequence of tasks. They wheeled the crate to the vault, and the head archivist signed for the item with an exacting hand. He insisted on preserving the catalogue entry rather than destroying the record. Elias watched the archivist transpose the folio's shelf number into the ledger. He then watched the archivist pencil a small correction into the entry. A scribbled marginal glyph no larger than a thumbprint beside the accession code. Elias leaned over to see and found a fresh marginal glyph penciled into the catalogue sheet with the same cramped hand as the manuscript's marginalia. The pencil mark had not been there an hour earlier. The discovery changed the moral calculus again. Containment had not fully sealed the risk. A new twist revealed itself. The catalogue could be a vector. Elias closed his mouth. He thought of his ring and the way the book had taken warmth. He thought of Jonah's wrist and the way the mark made the ring's outline on skin. He realized the manuscript's agency moved through records as easily as through flesh. The book had not only required witnesses in its room. It had learned to mark the archive itself. Suspicion hardened into a cold realism. The danger would migrate through institutional systems if they let it. They edited the catalogue entry under cover of pretense, adding a non-standard accession code and misdirecting the shelf coordinate. Miriam placed her hand on the ledger and wrote a short line of obfuscation in her careful script. The head archivist signed reluctantly and with clipped motions. "This will be reviewed in committee," he said. "The library must balance access and safety." He did not mention Jonah's palm. He did not mention Elias' ring. Policies would be rewritten and forms would be updated. Elias watched him close the ledger and place the penciled glyph beneath a blot of archival paste. Elias stayed behind at the catalogue desk and opened the folio's microfilm notes from previous custodians. He scanned acquisition records and found a terse line he had missed before. A 17th century donation note that referenced a family signet and a sealed testament. The donor's surname matched, faintly, to Elias' own lineage by marriage. The paper trail curved back into his family-sold name. The twist tightened. Possessions and books, ring and folio had converged through a history of exchange. Elias felt betrayal ripple through him, not the grand theatrical betrayal, but a domestic kind that cracked trust into records and inherited objects. He heard a sound and turned. Miriam stood in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, and the junior conservator behind her with a stack of gloves. Jonah had been moved to an infirmary cot in a nearby wing until they could consult a physician. The head archivist walked away with the crate in a cart and with a list of officials to notify Elias, Miriam, handing him a cup. "You did what you had to do. You read. You bound it? We are alive." Her voice contained both relief and accusation. She had saved Jonah from a flight into the stacks. She had pressed a hand to the ledger and misdirected the catalogue. She had also, with Elias, become part of the manuscript's binding. Elias set the cup down with both hands. He thought of the ring's scorch. He thought of Jonah's hollowed face. He felt a quiet responsibility that tasted like iron in his mouth. He did not speak long. He spoke in practical sentences: arrange a watch on Jonah, record his symptoms, contact conservation committees in the morning, restrict access to the ledger entry. He listed actions. Miriam repeated them back in short lines and added a note about the junior conservator inspecting for contamination. The archivist's steps receded. Outside, the library steps were wet from dawn's rain and a courier's bicycle rattled past. A small, unexpected discovery shifted their understanding again. Elias examined the pencil glyph beneath the ledger's paste under a loupe and found faintly, a secondary stroke beneath the graphite. A fingernail press where the motif had been traced in wet ink, and then erased before the pencil had been applied. The press matched Jonah's fingernail shape. Jonah had not been near the catalogue desk. The implication was stark and physical. Either the manuscript had marked the ledger through someone who had handled both book and catalogue earlier, or the book had produced the mark through some contactless influence. Elias's suspicion doubled into cautious dread. He placed the loop down slowly. They closed the vault door. The crate went into a locked bay with 2 different keys and a sealed log. The committee promised a review. Jonah's palm smoldered in the infirmary, and the physician noted a thermal lesion in the pattern of a signet. The junior conservator catalogued samples of pigment and binding resin. Miriam and Elias filed an incident report that omitted phrases likely to trigger administrative panic. They used dry, concrete language instead. They recorded measurements and times, names and actions. At noon, the head archivist returned with a legal representative and a conservator from the University Oversight Board. They questions in a policy-driven syntax was the ring on site, who read the clause aloud. What are the precise custody logs? The questions were clinical. Elias answered crisply. He gave names, dates, and a list of motions. He described the book's reaction without metaphor. He held to facts. Jonah held the book. Miriam pressed the wax. Elias read the clause. The room's mood shifted. The legal presence transformed fear into paperwork. That transformation angered Elias. He sensed the book's hazard becoming wrapped in forms. He corrected a ledger date. He insisted on adding the pencil glyph notation to the incident report. The oversight conservator, a woman named Drutta Hart, paused over the incident sheet and then said, "We need to trace provenance more rigorously. The signet's inscription may be the key to lineage. It may explain why the book selected Jonah's hand." Drutta Hart spoke plainly and gave a plan. Cross-check family donations and probate records. Her voice had authority and an air of controlled curiosity. Elias felt a complex relief, a professional response that did not trivialize the event. They worked through the afternoon. Jonah's condition stabilized but did not reverse. The stage-like lines on his palm grew faintly translucent and were tender to touch. Miriam scheduled a conservator's treatment for the folio's pigment samples. Drutta Hart began a chain of emails to specialists in ritual binding manuscripts. Elias wrote a cover letter that laid out the sequence of actions and the moral choice they had made. He noted, with a single sentence, that the book had altered the catalogue entry and that a marginal glyph had appeared in pencil. That line would likely be flagged for review. In a private moment at the catalogue desk, Elias opened his pocket journal. He had drawn a set of marginal studies over the last days. The crawling ink, transcriptions of marginal phrases, the small painted knot that now sat sealed beneath resin. He added a final entry, a measured description of the binding and the scorch mark on his ring. He dated the note and then made a deliberate decision. He would not keep the ring in his desk any longer. He carried the ring to the infirmary on a folded piece of paper and asked the nurse to hold it under custody. He did not explain more than that the ring must be kept separate from library property for now. The day closed with procedures and small, practical decisions. The crate was moved into an internal vault with restricted temperature control. Access required 2 sign-offs. Jonah's medical chart indicated observation for thermal lesions and stress reaction. Miriam left her gloves on the table, numbered and catalogued for later analysis. The head archivist refiled the ledger under a new accession code. Elias felt the chapter's pressure crumple into a set of concrete mitigations. As Elias turned to leave the reading wing, he paused at the catalogue desk. The pencil glyph glinted faintly beneath the desk lamp. He leaned in for a final look with a loupe. Under magnification, the glyph's graphite edges were irregular, as if pressed over ink that had been scraped away. Elias ran a gloved finger at the paste's edge and found a hairline crack. He did not say anything. He wrote one more line in his pocket journal. catalog glyph persists. Monitor entries. He placed the journal back into his satchel and closed the reading wing door behind him. Outside, rain had stopped. Elias walked to his office with short strides. He felt the day's choices like bruises. The oath spoken aloud, Jonah Smark, the ring escorch, the catalog's glyph. He had won a containment that cost a palm and the scorch of a family signet. The ledger was misdirected but not immune. He knew the manuscript's agency could still find channels. He also knew they had added safeguards. Double locks, full successioning, committee review, and a network of specialists now aware of an active threat. He returned to the small steps at his office and sat in his chair. Jonah's breathing came to mind and a concrete image of Miriam pressing her glove to the broken seal. He thought of Hart's plan to trace provenance to understand why the book had chosen Jonah or his ring. He opened the morning's incident report to add one last observational note. The book had completed its clause only when human voices read its terms and human hands confirmed the gestures. That fact anchored their future choices. It meant they could control risk with procedure and careful refusal. It also meant the manuscript had learned how to mark records. Elias placed his hand on the lamp and then closed the report. He then reached for the crate's final packing slip, the one Miriam had left on his desk. He ran his thumb over the wax residue and found, beneath the grain of the paper, a faint, erased pencil stroke. It matched the glyph in the ledger. Elias understood, with a clarity that had no relief in it, that the book's influence had not been wholly physical. The object had found a way to leave traces in layers of the archive where human hands recorded and verified. The containment was partial and purchased with human cost. He rose and moved to the small window above his desk. Light from a thin sun fell across the vault's courtyard. He turned the ring over in his hand and then placed it into a small envelope with Jonah's name written on it. He slid the envelope into the satchel that contained the incident notes. He locked the satchel with an ordinary padlock and placed it into the safe. He did not tell anyone precisely where the ring would be kept. He made a concrete decision. The ring must be separated from the archive until they could map its provenance and until specialists could test whether the engraving carried agents embedded in metalwork or inherited ritual notation. A courier knocked at the door. Elias looked up. The day had resolved into small actions, each step recorded, each choice visible in the ledger. He opened the door. The courier handed a single sheet, a committee meeting notice for 10 a.m. the next day. Elias took it and signed the receipt. He closed the door. The final action in the chapter was a practical one. He placed the committee notice into the satchel beside Jonah's envelope and the incident log. He locked the safe and left the room with a measured gait. The crate's seal held. Jonah slept under observation. Miriam and the junior conservator prepared samples. The ledger contained a hidden glyph. Elias walked down the corridor and stopped at the vault door. He pressed his palm to the cold metal and then left without looking back. The chapter ends on a concrete, material beat. Elias closed the vault door, the tumblers clicked, and a small, neat key slid into the archivist's pocket. The key's weight reassured nothing. It only recorded one more step in a long list of practical protections. He walked away with the satchel, the ring separated, and a catalog entry that now required deliberate oversight. The manuscript remained sealed, but its pencil mark persisted in the ledger, visible only under loop and suspicion. The final note in his pocket journal read, "Containment achieved. Agency persists. Trace provenance. Monitor catalog. Jonah stable." Further binding tests prohibited. Elias folded the journal shut. He put the satchel over his shoulder and left the reading wing to deliver the committee notice. The corridor swallowed his footfalls. Behind him, the vault door remained closed. The catalog lamp flickered, and the pencil glyph held its place, a small, unresolved sign that the archive could no longer be entirely trusted to contain what it catalogued.